nirasya sarva sandeham akikritti sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilashojitam Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananam Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Man Anulavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tishe Namah Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Param Bhojo Radha Madana Mohano Adadanastrinam dantair yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Param Bhojo dhūlī-sadṛśaṁ janma janmani Abhirapali patiputra kanta dasya bilashati balashvavara Sri Rupa Chintamala sapti sangsto matsvanta durdhanta hechurastam Raganuganu bhajanola samanasanam Shri Radhaya sahasara smaratam brajendhum Shri Rupa pada kamala shrita chetasame Chittam satam marukari yatu pada padme Bhaktir ya nikilarga varga janani Ya brahma sakshat kriter anandatishaya prada Vishaya jat sukyat vimuktir yaya Shri Radha Ramanam param bhujayugam Yasya mahanashrayo Yakarya guru Brajalokavat gurutara Premnaiva tasyai namah Yaram ya nikilarga vargajan Ayaram ya nikila Aghashanga shamani shrotratritim sangata Yasvadhyai rasikai sukabdi janani dhikarya mukti spriham Yadhyata hridaye vrajendra tanūja premamrita syandini Saji yadhari bhakta vrinda mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. So by the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava charges, the fulfiller of his heart's desire in this world, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again today we will continue our discussion of Padyavali. And we resume at the end of the Dainyokti Prakaran. Hopefully today we will complete this section, and we're part of the way through our discussion of the 5th verse of Sriman Mahaprabhu's Shikshastakam. So in our last discussion, we went into the philosophical side of things, discussing how it is that the jiva is described to be, quote, fallen in material existence and to have, quote, forgotten Krishna, when in fact jivas in samsara have existed there beginninglessly and never had awareness of him either beginninglessly. So the purpose of this language of falling and forgetting is to convey that awareness of Bhagavan and being in his dham, being in his personal presence, rendering personal service to him are supremely desirable and are the ultimate fulfillment of the jiva's potential. So to convey that the situation of a jiva in samsara with reference to its potential is something like the opposite of a fish out of water, or in other words, as a fish not in water is unable to, fulfill any of its normal or ideal functions, so also a jiva who's still in the water is unable to have its natural faculty or its jivaness utilized by Bhagavan's bhakti shakti to bring about superlative bliss for both Bhagavan and the jiva. So today we'll look a little bit more at the psychology of this entanglement. In other words, this metaphor of being fallen and floundering in an ocean, what does that actually refer to? What is it that perpetuates the conditioning of the jiva in samsara and makes it as though intraversable or inescapable the way someone stranded in the middle of an ocean might feel? So what does that actually allude to? And then what is the intent of Mahaprabhu's prayer in seeking to be like a particle of dust at Bhagavan's feet? So that will be our subject matter for today. And with that, this is the last verse in the section expressing humility or expressions of humility on the part of Bhaktas. So we'll complete that. So I'm picking up from where we left off. This is midway through the commentary. I've got a paragraph starting, the beginningless perpetuation. So the beginningless perpetuation of the jiva's quote-unquote forgetting and remaining quote-unquote fallen is cyclically sustained over the course of the innumerable material universes, beginningless and endless cycles of emanation and dissolution throughout the realm of samsara by Bhagavan's Maya Shakti. In this regard, it is explained in Srimad Bhagavatam 3.12.2, quote, at the beginning of an emanation of the universe, the original creator, Lord Brahma, emanated the 5 functions of agyan, or ignorance, namely, anda tamishra, blinding darkness, tamisra, darkness, maha moha, severe delusion, moha, delusion, and tamas, dimness. Sri Chakravartipad, elaborating on, don't need a da there, pardon me, Sri Samipad's commentary explains this verse as follows. The functions of avidya were indeed pre-existent. At the beginning of the emanation of the universe, they appeared from Brahma in the forms of tamas and so forth. So the Bhagavatam repeatedly speaks of what is called anadi avidya, or beginningless avidya, which envelops an infinity of jivas beginninglessly, some of whom are emanated out or cast out into material universes when they cycle into manifestation. So thus, Maitreya says, Sasar Jagre, he speaks this verse. Therein, non-illumination of the nature of the jiva is called tamas, or dimness. So there's a progression here, going from, light to heavy, or in the intensity of problematic condition. So first of all, there is non-illumination of the nature of the jiva. This is a dimming, so to speak. Then, ascription of the sense of I to the body and so on is called moha, or delusion. So you can't convince someone of something that's not the case unless you suppress their awareness of what is the case. So you can make someone think that they're not who they are if, first of all, you somehow can prevent them from understanding who they are. Now we know that the jiva can only experience cognition when it has a subtle body outfitted by the Maya Shakti. So this, dimming of the nature of the jiva isn't non-illumination of the nature of the jiva is actually something that's taking place in the psyche or in the what's called the antakaran, so that the nature of the jiva doesn't reflect into the antakaran and then result in perception of itself accurately. There's a dimmer, so to speak, or an opacity layer laid down in the antakaran such that in the, so to speak, mirror of the chitta, as Mahaprabhu spoke of it, there isn't a clear reflection such that the jiva can directly cognize its own nature. So the instrument in which the cognition is taking place, using the power supplied to it by the jiva, is altered or is, fixed, if you will, so that it doesn't function with full clarity, but that absence of clarity is not made known to the perceiver. In other words, if you give someone some binoculars and say, oh yeah, these will sharpen your vision, when in fact they're actually obscuring your vision, but the person is led to believe that this is actually giving them a more accurate perception of something when it might be actually hiding the object of perception. Something like that. There's an initial influence of Maya such that there's a non-illumination of the nature of the jiva, and then there's this ascription or this faculty of the sense of I that's within the jiva combined with the faculty of ahankara in the psyche work together to experience or create the experience of a sense of I in something other than the jiva, namely the body. So then, moving forward, ascription of myness or a sense of belonging to enjoyable objects of the senses is called mahamoha or severe delusion. So once you're invested into something external, then what is associated with that external entity that one has identified as I acquires the status of being mine. So this is severe delusion because it's a delusion based on a delusion. And perhaps also because it's more, is more specifically what drags one into involvement in the realm of karma, which further perpetuates this whole process, as we'll get to later. Adoption of anger, a quality of the mind, when obstructions to enjoyment occurs, is called tamisra, darkness. So once one has a sense of maya in relation to things, then there comes intermediately the pursuit of pleasure, and when that's obstructed, then there's this unrest, this heat experienced in the psyche called anger, and that is, like darkness. Or in other words, one was in this dim, misconceived state, and when anger arises, then all scope of clarity is lost, and death in the form of stupor, constituted of or arising from a state of anger, is called andhatamisra, or blinding darkness. So to the point that one, from a qualitative perspective, becomes completely inactive or completely acting contrary to what would be suitable or best for them. So this is how this progression of the conditioning is outlined here in the Bhagavad. So now we'll look at some alternate ways that this is categorized. Although these 5 functions of ignorance do not belong to the jiva, that is, are not part of the jiva's essential nature, they are emanated through avidya. That is, they are experienced by a jiva enmeshed in the Maya Shakti. Similarly, it is said in Vishnu Puran, quote, indiscrimination shall be considered tamas, and unsteadiness of the mind, moha. Desire for the pleasure of village or worldly enjoyment is to be known as mahamoha. Death is called andhatamisra, and anger is called tamisra. These 5 aspects of avidya manifested from the great soul, namely Brahma. So he's citing the Vishnu Puran to support the way that he's interpreted these 5 terms in the Bhagavatam, and they're more or less synonymous. The only difference being that in his interpretation, Mahamoha, or severe delusion, is associated with minus, and here in the Vishnu Puran it's associated with raga, or the desire for enjoyment. So you could say these are, they're both required in the process, and so in either way of categorizing them, the other would be taken to be a sub-implied step. Then, these 5 aspects are stated also in the work of Patanjali, namely the Yoga Sutras. Quote, the 5 afflictions of avidya, the 5 afflictions are avidya, ignorance, asmita, egotism, raga, attachment, dvesha, aversion, and abhinivesha, clinging to life or fearing death. Alternately, Sri Vishnu Sami has spoken of, that is, described 5 functions of ignorance as follows. Ajnana, ignorance, viparyasa, misunderstanding, bhed, division, bhai, fear, and shoka, grief. In actuality, however, avidya only is of 2 natures. So he's saying, okay, the Vishnu Puran says it like this, the Bhagavatam says it like this, the Yoga Sutras say it like that, Vishnu Sami says it like this. They're more or less all in line with slight differences, but we can boil it down to 2 core points, which are as follows. Covering and projecting, avarana and viṣame. That is, it has 2, meaning Maya, has 2 fundamental functions, covering the jiva's awareness of its own essential nature and projecting its awareness towards constituents of Maya. These 2 functions are referred to by the words avidya and asmita by Patanjali, and by the words ajnana and viparyasa by Vishnu Sami. Although raga, dvesh, and abhinivesh are, however, of the nature of the psyche, that is, not aspects of avidya itself, they are spoken of as being expressions of projecting, that is, of the projecting aspect of avidya, because of the predominance of the projecting aspect in them. This is to be understood. So essentially he's saying there's the initial element that covers, and then the rest is all outcomes, or the unfolding of the sense of I being projected onto something that it's not. So the I is projected onto something it's not, then things associated with that object are considered mine, those are desired, the desires are thwarted, and then there is fear, anger, and so forth. So in this way, the jiva, enveloped in this beginning this ignorance and this antakaran, or this psyche wherein such states take place, perpetually remains bound in what we call samsara. So, the 2 fundamental functions of beginningless ignorance, anadi avidya, mentioned by Sri Chakravartipad in the aforesaid commentary, are set forth by Sri Jivapad in Paramatma Sandarbha. So, Chakravartipad is giving this point, and it's drawn from an earlier statement made of Jiva Gosvami, which is as follows. Now, the aspect of Maya known as avidya has 2 functions. That constituted of covering, avaranatmika, and that constituted of projecting, vikshepatmika. Therein, the former exists in, that is, casts its influence over the jiva, and covers, that is, suppresses the jiva's inherent awareness. And the latter produces attachment in the jiva, that is, binds the jiva, with awareness of that which is other than itself. That is, it captivates the jiva by causing it, in the absence of any perception of its own essential nature, as induced by the covering function, to cast its awareness outwards towards the constituents of Maya and identify with them. So essentially, it uses the jiva's own capacity for consciousness against itself by taking that capacity for consciousness, that sense of I that the jiva can foster, and misdirecting it such that the jiva becomes perpetually chained to or identified with, and thus chained to something that it's not, using its own faculty to create that sense of attachment. Just as, a worldly example might be something like politicians or, large company owners. They control people using people's own desires. People want money or people want certain faculties, so they say, okay, you have to do this X, Y, and Z, and then we'll provide you with what you want. So then the people do what the people in power want them to do, because they're driven by their own desire to get what they want. So those in power use the desire of people in a way that keeps them doing what they want those people to be doing. So something like that, the faculty of the jiva is then used by Maya to keep the jiva itself bound within Maya. So a little more detail on how this works is also discussed elsewhere in the Bhagavatam. The gist of the process whereby the jiva enmeshed in samsara, that is, enveloped in the adjuncts of Maya, known as the antakarana, literally the inner faculty, that is, the subtle body constituted of a mind, intellect, ego, or ahankar, and subconscious, chitta, to a bahir-karana, or outer faculty, namely the five senses, and the gross body, has its inherent awareness projected outwards such that it identifies itself with these adjuncts of Maya and remains engrossed in them, is described by Hamsa Bhagavan to the four Kumaras in Srimad Bhagavatam. So how this plays out, so to speak, in the psyche, there's some additional detail given on that here. So Hamsa Bhagavan says the following: O sons, the mind becomes absorbed in the gunas, that is, the sense objects, and the gunas absorbed in the mind. I've got my mind on my money and my money on my mind, said some rap song when I heard when I was a kid. So a good example here of Hamsa Bhagavan's statement. The mind becomes absorbed in the... Excuse me?
Sorry, I was laughing.
Oh. The mind becomes absorbed in the gunas, and the gunas absorbed in the mind. Both the gunas and the mind are bodies of, that is, external adjuncts to the jiva, who is constituted of me, that is, of consciousness. The mind remains absorbed in the gunas because of constant attendance to the gunas, and the gunas likely remain strongly apparent in the mind. Sri Chakravarti Pad elucidates the psychological dynamics spoken of here in his commentary. The mind enters the gunas, that is, the vishayas, the objects of the senses, and the gunas enter the mind. Thus so, both the gunas and the mind are bodies, that is, mere superimposed adjuncts, and not the essential nature of the jiva, who is, quote, constituted of me, madatmanaha, meaning is Brahman in essential nature by virtue of being constituted of consciousness. So neither the objects of the perception nor the faculty of perception, namely the psyche or the mind, are inherent in the jiva's nature. The jiva is the pure conscious entity independent of those, though, quote-unquote, dependent on them to experience specific cognition of specific objects. So, furthermore, how can you all strive for the mind and the gunas' mutual abandonment of one another? That is, how can you all endeavor to separate the two from each other when they are both only adjuncts distinct from your own essential nature and functioning constantly in a way that reinforces their mutual enmeshment? So the Kumaras had inquired from Hamsa Bhagavan about the process of realizing Brahman and breaking out of the mind being focused on the gunas. So here, part of the reply, or part of the import of the reply, is this idea that the the mind and the gunas, how are you going to separate these two? Because they're constantly functioning in a way that reinforces their mutual entanglement with each other. The more the mind cognizes objects of the senses, the more the samskaras of those objects get ingrained in the mind, and thus the more the mind continues to think of them. So how are you going to break that cycle? Their mutual abandonment of one another is certainly difficult. The mind remains definitively absorbed in the gunas because of samskaras, for them, which are very firmly ingrained in the mind because of verily beginningless constant attendance to the gunas. So you've got an infinity of past experience or past ingraining and impressioning of the psyche to experience objects of the senses. There's no beginning to this process, since the psyche transmigrates with the jiva from one gross body to another gross body to another gross body, and even at the dissolution of the Brahmanda, when even that subtle body is destroyed or dissolved, some subtle record, if you will, of all that impressioning remains, and then that is allocated again at the remanifestation of another universe into which that particular jiva is cast. So there's this beginningless ingraining of one's psyche with an infinity of worldly experiences of worldly objects. So how is the mind not going to think of those objects when it's been conditioned to do that and nothing but that? Not an easy task. And unless something else comes into the equation, there's not going to be any change to its outcome. So, how shall it be able to abandon them? It won't be able so long as it remains engrossed in the gunas. This is the purport. So you might say, well, okay, this is quite a trap here. How are we ever going to end this? The gunas also again and again strongly appear in the mind in the form of vasanas. So we experience the mind constantly going to objects, but why is the mind going to those objects? Because there's an upwelling of the vasana, or the inclination for those objects, which is you could say, the upwelling of that object in the mind in the form of that inclination for it. They are constantly present there. Therefore, how also shall the gunas be able to abandon that, the mind? In other words, this impressioning from the gunas is equated with the, quote, presence of the gunas in the mind. So because that impressioning is so deep and been perpetual, there's going to be no end to it. So the gunas are going to keep coming up in the mind is going to keep going into the gunas. So this churning, if you will, of the psyche in this way, which perpetuates the jiva's bondage, works like this. So while we have a lot of poetry and we have a lot of metaphoric language about why material existence is like an ocean and so on, essentially this ocean is this ingraining and this programming of the psyche in this way is essentially what is referred to as this intraversable ocean. So because of this perpetual conditioning of the psyche towards objects other than Bhagavan and Bhakti, that is affected by constant perception of external objects in worldly life. The ocean of material existence in the verse under discussion is said to be untraversable, or viṣame, meaning impossible to overcome by one's own means and thus effectively without bounds, that is, endless and thus impassable. The word viṣame can also be understood to convey the sense of troublesome and allude to the profuse sufferings that jivas in samsara undergo as a result of their mundane conditioning and identification. Sri Prabodhananda Saraswati has written a prayer to Sriman Mahaprabhu, similar to the prayer under discussion, which summarizes the jiva's plight in samsara with reference to the aforesaid condition of the jivas therein. Quote, O Chaitanya Chandra, please extend the support of your feet to I, shelterless and fettered by harmful vasanas, who have fallen into the ocean of the suffering of samsara and been seized by the crocodiles and sea dragons of kama, anger, and so forth. Just as someone in an ocean who is shackled cannot swim to save themselves and thus suffers miserably, so a jiva who is shelterless in samsara because of being oblivious of Bhagavan and shackled by the vasanas in their psyche that perpetuate fixation upon objects other than Bhagavan and bhakti, also suffers miserably. As such a shackled person in the ocean is easy prey for crocodiles and sea dragons, so a jiva becomes utterly enmeshed in desires for objects of the senses, the anger that arises when those desires are obstructed, and the other forms of psychological bondage that ensue from having worldly desires, namely greed, delusion, arrogance, envy, enmity, and so on. As a shackled person attacked underwater by a crocodile or sea dragon is sure to die, so a jiva in the aforementioned condition invariably exists in a state equivalent to spiritual lifelessness, meaning they remain perpetually engrossed in a state of suffering, delusion, and non-awareness or forgetfulness of Bhagavan and bhakti. So, hope this doesn't sound too daunting, or, it doesn't end there, but this is a rather stark analysis of the condition. So the Bhagavatam elaborates on this and also turns the conversation towards what can be done. The only hope for jivas in this condition is the shelter and grace of Sri Bhagavan. So 399, this is cited by Jiva Gosvami and Bhakti Sandarbha, related to Sharanagati. O Isha, as long as a person shall see this supposed separateness, that is apparent independence, of the self from Bhagavan, which is in effect the power of the illusion manifested by the objects of the senses, some smriti, that is recurrent transmigration throughout material existence, which is possessed of the results of actions and productive of a myriad of sufferings, shall not cease even though it is vain, that is, devoid of any real substance, meaning, or value. And then another statement, this comes from Satyavrata in the 8th canto, in praise of Bhagavan. Those whose awareness of the self has been covered by beginningless ignorance, who are thus suffering from the toil of samsara, the root of which is this, that is, this beginningless ignorance, and who have somehow, by the grace of a bhakta, that is, become sheltered, can attain you, Bhagavan, who are the giver of complete liberation and our supreme Guru. So how can the jiva whose psyche is conditioned like this come out of this conditioning? There has to be some impetus to bring thought of bhakti, thought of Bhagavan, into the awareness of that jiva. So in the verse under discussion, Sriman Mahaprabhu, speaking from the perspective of a jiva bound in samsara, thus prays for Sri Krishna's grace and shelter. Please graciously consider me to be like a speck of dust fixed at your lotus feet, since it is only by receiving Sri Krishna's grace and taking shelter in him that one can transcend the conditioning of samsara, rooted in the identification with the material body brought about by Maya. So also in the Bhagavatam it is said, if those whom he, Bhagavan, the Unlimited, shall grace, take shelter at his feet in all respects without duplicity, that is, sincerely without extraneous desires, then they will cross beyond his difficult to surmount divine Maya and come to know him, and they will have no mentality of my and I in regard to that which is food for dogs and jackals, that is, the material body. So some harsh language is used there on purpose to convey a sense of trying to evoke some degree of detachment from the body. So essentially, one's psyche is so conditioned, and only by turning the mind, turning one's awareness towards Bhagavan, seeking to be in his shelter, seeking to be absorbed in thought of him, can this cycle be broken. As per Sri Kaviraj Goswami Pad's aforestated explanation, Sriman Mahaprabhu's prayer, quote, "Please graciously consider me to be like a speck of dust fixed at your lotus feet," further conveys a prayer to engage in Sri Krishna's service. Quote, "Please graciously make me like a speck of dust at your lotus feet. Please engage your servant in your service." The sense is thus that Sriman Mahaprabhu is not literally praying to become an insentient and inactive particle of dust, but rather to be regarded as like, he uses the word sadṛśaṁ, one in the sense that he wants to remain ever engaged and fixed in the service of Sri Krishna's feet, such that he does not lose his connection with such engagement, even when obstacles arise that push him away from that, just as a particle of dust can remain fixed on a person's foot even after attempts to wipe or wash it away are made. In this way, the prayer conveys humility, which is the theme of the section, and why it's being quoted here, by expressing both desire to be accepted as a servant, such that one can everlastingly engage in service with bhakti to Sri Krishna, and a sense of lowliness, which is also a characteristic of humility, in regard to oneself, despite one's qualities, through the likening of oneself to a particle of dust. So, just on a personal note, I can always say that from the first time that I would read the Shikshastakam, I always found it a little bit odd that he prayed to be a particle of dust on Krishna's feet, and some of the renderings that I would read, they wouldn't preserve the word sadṛśa in the explanation. So it was just read as if that's literally what he wants, is to actually be a particle of dust. And that was interpreted to mean to evoke a sense of humility, but sometimes it was nevertheless taken literally. So what I've tried here, and this point is also made by some of the Sanskrit commentators, that this word sadṛśa is important. It's not that he literally actually wants to become a particle of dust, or that if we apply this in the case of a sadhaka, if we take this prayer as something to support, as a teaching to support sadhakas, prayer should be in accord with the specificity of one's spiritual aspiration. So if one is following the path of Raganuga Bhakti, if one has aspiration for a particular bhava of a particular class of parikaras of Bhagavan, those parikaras of Bhagavan in Braja are not just particles of dust, right? They are people. They are filled with so many wonderful attributes and activities and so forth. And all of one's sadhana should ultimately attune and aspire to that specific object that one aspires to. So it would be off, if you will, if one were to sometimes pray and engage in worship with one aim, and then at another time say, I want to be this, and at another time that, and so on. So therefore, this word sadṛśa is important because it's making it clear that he wants to be like that because of a particular characteristic that exhibits, and that it's that characteristic in the bhav that he aspires to is what he's actually praying for, what is his actual object of attainment, and that the prayer is actually a means to that pursuit. So, a little more on that as we conclude. Sriman Mahaprabhu addresses Sri Krishna as Son of Nanda to convey that his prayer is for service to the Sri Krishna of Braja, he whose Madhurya is preeminent on account of its power to inspire the spirit of servitude, within the hearts of all, irrespective of the general nature of their relationship with him, as was discussed earlier. So we went through those examples given by Kaviraj Goswami Pad in the Adi Lila of Charitamrita, where he shows that all the devas, even Lakshmi, even Nanda and Yashoda, even the cowherd boys, even the gopis, even Krishna himself, everyone, by virtue of the wondrousness of Krishna's Madhurya, is inspired not only with prema bhakti for him, but bhakti that even expresses itself in the form of servitude. There's such waves of wondrousness that they evoke such levels of appreciation that even those whose personal relationship with Krishna is much more than servitude, at times, even out of what you might loosely call gratitude, even feel the spirit of servitude towards him, according to circumstance. So that was something that we discussed previously. So Sriman Mahaprabhu, this point is being made that there's a specificity of a prayer to the Krishna of Braja here. So when he's praying to be like a particle of dust, which actually means he's praying to have a constant absorption or an everlasting engagement in service, then that can also be understood to be an expression of the parikaras of Braja for Krishna as per the circumstances when that desire or inclination to servitude comes out in their hearts. Such as in one of the previous examples, the statements of Nandamarj on behalf of the whole community of Braj when Uddhava is returning to Mathura after having spent some months in Braja as a representative or a messenger of Krishna. And Nandamarj says, let us always, let our minds always remember Krishna, let our bodies always bow down to him. And even though he's the father of Krishna, even though he's the chief of the village to which Krishna belongs, he even speaks of himself as a worshipper or as like a servant of Krishna. So this is not something that he feels every day, but this is something that in that circumstance of separation, conveying a collective feeling of the whole community as a message of humility and love for Uddhava to convey to Krishna, this expression comes out, if you will. Then, going into a little further specificity, Sriman Mahaprabhu also begins this prayer with the particle ai as an address to express a gentle entreaty and sense of timidity. So the particle ai carries the function of an entreaty, but it's known as a soft way of doing so. It is also understood that he utters this particle and the remainder of the verse with a faltering voice as a result of an outpouring of emotion. So when he's making this prayer, he's not, reciting it while he's getting distracted and thinking of someone else in some kind of formal rote, but he's so deeply moved by his longing for Krishna that this state of abject urgency, like he's floundering in the middle of an ocean he can never cross, and in an urgent state of need, he's filled with emotion, choking out these words as he's saying this. And moreover, the particle ai is most commonly used by women. And thus, some take it that the usage of it in this verse subtly implies that the verse is expressed by Sriman Mahaprabhu not only with the mentality of being a jiva in samsara and the bhava of a bhakta in general, but as an expression of his absorption in Sri Radha's bhava for Krishna, as Sri Radha on occasion, especially when absorbed in a state of humility, speaks of herself as a servant of Sri Krishna. Sri Kaviraj Goswami Pad in this regard cites an example from the Brahmar Gita in Srimad Bhagavatam. Quote, O Bata, O gentle one, Does Arya's son now dwell in Madhupuri? Does he remember his father's abodes, his relatives, and the cowherds? Does he ever engage in talk of us, his maidservants? When will he place his guru-scented hand on our heads? So the Brahmar Gita are statements known to have been made by Sri Radhika in the Bhagavad, and here she speaks of us, his maidservants. So she speaks of herself as well as her fellow Sakhis and Gopis as those who foster the sense of being maidservants of Krishna, even though they're much more than that in their spirit of humility, and in this context of separation, that sentiment also arises in their hearts. So some take it in that way, although that would be, a more subtle or a less central import. So that's all I have on this verse. So I'll pause here. If anyone has any comments or questions, anything otherwise, please feel free to share. Let me just click over there. I heard someone. Yes.
Is it me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's all beautiful. I mean, it's very nice to hear the history, if you can say, or the origin of or conditioning of the jiva, and how it is helplessly entangled in the ocean. And if you imagine ocean, then you can understand how deep jiva is placed in, with no hope. Actually, there's no hope, really. If you can visually, like graphically imagine, you are in the ocean. Where's the end? It's just, it's terrifying, actually. And I heard somewhere that, there's one, where is this? This example given, the jiva meeting guru is like, a turtle just finding the hole in a plank floating on the surface. That's how jiva is so not destined actually to meet guru, that if it finds, it's like, oh, what happened? It's an accident, and so it's a joy and sadness at the same time. But listening to all this traumatic existence of jiva, I'm just thinking, are our acaryas and Vedas in particular, are they dealing with something like epistemology? Why things are as they are? Are they trying to answer, like, in purva-paksha, did you read any purva-paksha stated by our acaryas? Why jiva is placed in such a situation? What's going on? Why? Because there must be purpose to it, right? Creation has a purpose. So why is jiva placed in such a helpless situation?
Okay, and you're raising that as a question, or you have a thought on that?
Yeah. Well, the thoughts precursed my question. The question ends with question mark. Why? Why all this? Did any acharya try to raise the question? Or audacity to dare to ask question, why Krishna created suffering or a helpless situation for jivas?
I mean, from the Sandarbhas, we see that Jiva Goswami takes it to, the anadi principle, essentially that which has no beginning has no cause. So there is no, so to speak, why as such. There's a certain, any philosophical system starts with a certain premise, otherwise it goes what they call anavasta. So philosophically, there's one sort of neat, sharp way of dealing with it, and just saying that this is it. It's just beginninglessly like this.
It is how it is.
Yeah. But from a more, pragmatic, if you will, perspective, it can also be said that the whole creation is ultimately an expression of Bhagavan's bliss, Leela, to Lokavatu Leela Kaivalyam. So ultimately, this is all, although there's suffering in it, this is all actually bliss. In other words, this is all an expression of Bhagavan's own nature, Bhagavan's own bliss, and somehow in the ultimate totality of it, it's satisfying and wonderful to him. And if we're fortunate and we can take shelter in him and have shraddha in that, then we too can someday experience that. And we too can come to acquire the perspective whereby it's all good and it's all beautiful and it's all ever more wonderful. And what appears to us to be, dire circumstances or a world full of injustice and suffering and so on, from, some other perspective, that's all incorporated in such a way that is ultimately appreciable from some absolute context. And the suffering that we perceive in the world today is a localized perspective of embodiment and attachment in relation to it, not, an ultimate or absolute perspective. This is one aspect. Others like to take the love approach, saying that, this suffering and these circumstances are all there to facilitate the otherness. That is what enables the togetherness to be felt. In other words, you can't feel the joy of being together unless there's an option to also be apart. So there has to be this otherness to create the experience of togetherness, as well as to create the experience of meeting after having been not together. So in that way it can have indirect utility in, enriching or creating the experience of uniting and thereafter relating harmoniously. These are some general ways it's sometimes dealt with if people venture to philosophize on it.
Exactly. Exactly. So it requires knowledge to understand the whole picture. But my question is rather like if acaryas, and I can see many times Vishwanath or Jiva Gosvami, all those great acaryas, but devotees, when they write tikas, they write purva-pakshas, they question their own statements even, right? So they have this question why and for what, in translating, commenting on different shlokas, but I'm just surprised that there's no, as you said, there's no clear purva-paksha state asking the very existence of Jiva. Why? It seems to be super important topic to discuss, because otherwise, if you leave it like this, hanging, it's just, if you have incomplete knowledge, it's the complete rejection of all things, it may lead to, right? So
how is that?
Well, somebody can be completely depressed by saying, oh my God, what did I deserve to do that? And, why God is so distant from my existence here.
But how does this imply that?
How? People may think that God is callous or heartless, throwing majority of his jivas, not majority, but some of the jivas, endlessly without even trace of how they can get from. I mean, there is a trace, but who can really have access to the the aids that help Jiva to get out from the entanglements. This is not public available. This is very intimate and kind of guhya, hidden, secretive teachings. Gita even says that all the teachings that I'm giving to you, they're like 3 or 4 levels of guhyam, gyatamam, gyataram, hidden, most hidden. They're not public available. How to go meet Bhagavan and establish ourselves in loving relationship. Those are hidden teachings, not public teachings. So that's what I'm saying. That have to be a selected person by the grace to understand and accept that horrific reality, actually, if you look objectively on the point, from that angle. That's my thought, But what else comes with it? It's thinking that although you said that jivas are completely, endlessly, or beginninglessly unaware of Bhagavan, still I find it interesting that every jiva has some kind of sense of introspectivity, and in difficult situation, the prayerful mood appears somewhere. They have no idea whom to address, but there's somebody somewhere that everything relies on. So when they suffer, they tend to do some little, introductory sharanagati to take shelter of Bhagavan. Some tiny level. I'm not talking about devotees, but in generally, some people have this introspectivity, praying to God, not even knowing that, meeting him or knowing that he exists, right? So there's both, this complete isolation of jiva and our unawareness. At the same time, jiva has its own kind of paramatma instinct, telling them where, subconsciously there is greater reality that we depend on.
And how are you positing that in? Are you saying like embodied beings in general have a tendency to do that, or are you positing that tendency in the constitution of the jiva itself?
Oh no. Well, that's a good question. I had in mind, I had just conditioned jivas. Observing life, you see that this is what's happening. People tend to have take shelter of some, prayerful mindset. Not even being very religious or anything like that, or committed to any religion, still have some sense of higher reality. So it's not that helpless from that angle, if you think that way. But same time, I wish, I don't know if I can improve on the creation. I would plead Krishna, please be more merciful to those jivas. Give them more hints, more help, give them more resources. If I could do that, if you could just pray for them. Not to be critical about God's situation, of course not, but out of compassion, out of like understanding my own situation. Not everybody is blessed with easy life or peaceful life. Some people suffer a lot, and they try to be devotees. Totally distracted by odds of life. So even they try, still they have lots of issues going on. Not wanting. So anyway, I'm just throwing many things in here, but basically just trying to waving hands of my conditioned situation, trying to understand and ask questions, and perhaps wish for the mercy to really spread wider and more deeper. It's a thought. I'm not trying to argue anything. Just perhaps maybe this will inspire discussion, but if not, that's fine.
Well, one thing that comes to mind, which I think is relevant, especially from persons coming from a non-Indic background, that we have we're sort of exposed to simplistic ideas of this supreme being who's omniscient and omnipresent and so on, and then there's a common tendency to see that God is responsible for everything, because that otherwise he's not omniscient or something. But if we look at how Jiva Goswami deals with some of these classical things, we can see that in Jiva Goswami's view, Bhagavan isn't exactly completely omniscient or omnipotent. There are, in other words, certain things are, like Bhagavan is understood to be the source of Shakti and all of its manifestations and its conditions, but not that he's sort of responsible as the creator for it. In other words, the way things are isn't exactly thought of as being like Bhagavan's creation as such, but the Jiva just exists beginninglessly, and so does Bhagavan, and it belongs to Bhagavan. But it's, in other words, but it's beginningless. In other words, for Jiva Goswami, that doesn't necessarily mean that Bhagavan is to be held responsible for everything, even though he's regarded as the possessor of everything. And similarly, he also makes the point, which is something that'll come up in our discussions of the Charitamrita fairly soon, that Bhagavan himself is not directly able to empathize with the plight of jivas in samsara because he's never been a jiva in samsara. Bhagavan is Bhagavan. He can't not be Bhagavan. He is who he is, and so he doesn't have the experience of being a samsari because he never has been one and never will be one. So Jiva Goswami says that compassion is evoked when you perceive in another a painful experience that you yourself have had. But if someone is experiencing something that you don't have, that you've never experienced, you can't exactly relate to that, or you can't necessarily know what the person in that situation would want you to do.
Yes, I understand that, but I think this may refer. I would gladly 100% accept it if you refer this to Nitya Parikaras. But Bhagavan, out of his, all comprehensiveness and awareness, he will be aware. If he says, I have a headache, does he have headache, or he wants to feel that he has headache? For example, so he has experience of some of the problems. If you want to experience suffering, he will, for the sake of his own lila, he will experience. Is that right?
Suffering is a general category. Samsaric suffering by a jiva is a specific type of suffering. And according to Jiva Goswami, Bhagavan never experiences that. So he gives the example that the absence of darkness in the sun is not a fault. Similarly, the absence of certain awarenesses, this is what you might call like limited omniscience, or like not quite omniscient, like not quite omnipotent, meaning he limits this idea of Bhagavan's, all-knowingness to say that he doesn't have that knowledge or that experience of suffering as a jiva does in samsara because he's not a jiva and never will be. But that absence in him is not a defect, but rather an ornament, just as it's a quality and an admirable feature of the sun that it's never dark. So he goes on to say that if somehow the experience of what jivas in samsara were suffering were to touch Bhagavan's heart, then the whole thing would end in a minute.
Yes.
But since we're still sitting here, since the world is still going on, that hasn't happened yet. So for him, philosophically, it's not possible.
Who was this devotee that was praying to Mahaprabhu? Please, I want to give me all the karma for all jivas, so everybody will be liberated and obtain bhakti. It was
Vasudev Datta.
Vasudev Datta, or
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's natural attempt of a devotee to just end this because it seems like it's unfair. So the devotee has that compassion, has
Yes, exactly.
that broad awareness, more awareness to Bhagavan in that sense,
Yeah,
in the sense
that
of
Jiva
understanding.
Goswami says exactly that. He says that although realized bhaktas are also completely free from material suffering, still, like people who woke up from a dream sometimes remember what they experienced in the dream, bhaktas who are free from material suffering still retain remembrance of what it's like, and therefore have the capacity to be compassionate towards those who are still subject to it. So this is part of his whole analysis, which we'll discuss this more in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, how Bhagavan's grace flows through the sat, or flows through the bhaktas into the world, and through the compassion of bhaktas, and for the fulfilling the wish of a bhakta, Bhagavan is ready at the drop of a hat, so to speak. So he's there to fulfill
because I have heard that
the will of his bhaktas and the will of the bhaktas to express compassion or the attainment of deliverance of jivas. So in that way, he takes agency in delivering people, gracing people, etc., etc., etc. But that's flowing through that channel, so to speak.
Yes. So many times we heard that, devotee is more merciful to the Bhagavan, and Guru, Krishna descends as Guru who feels your situation. But now when you explain that way, that's just, it makes more sense. I think this is a very important topic to be really understanding, to better understand, because it helps to actually understand our position properly, right?
Well, we'll definitely get into more discussion of that soon. I was just working on some points related to this in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, which will come before long.
Thank you. And can I have one more? Any more hands? Because I have one more question.
Okay, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm not very familiar with Hamsa Avatar pastimes with Kumaras. Did this happen after they came from Vaikuntha or before they went to Vaikuntha?
Before, I mean, there's some manifestation of the Kumaras that always remain within the Brahmanda. They dwell in Tapaloka, I believe.
I'm sorry, where?
I believe it's Tapaloka. They're in the Bhagavatamrita describes how they're present there in meditation as like their place, if you will.
So there's like seed place, like the beach location, right? Loka for them. But so they have some different avesh in order to move about and go to Vaikuntha and do other things. Mm-hmm. That's the separate set of Kumars?
I guess you could say that, or not, either way. I mean, there's pairs of simultaneously coexistent parikaras of, Brahmas and Shivas and Indras and Kumaras and all the Brahmandas and all that. So.
Okay. Right. Okay. Thank you.
Then the second hand.
Jai Radhe, Pranam Baba. Thank you very much for the class. I have a few questions. The first one about it was discussed in the very beginning of the class that avidya is beginningless, and also there was a verse from Srimad Bhagavatam 3.12.2, in which it said that avidya was emanated, 5 aspects of avidya was emanated from Brahma. And also in the next verse by Sri Swamipada, it was also said that 5 aspects of avidya manifested from Brahma. And I'm wondering, what is the correct way to understand that avidya, 5 aspects of avidya is beginningless, and yet simultaneously they were emanated or manifested from Brahma? How to understand this?
Means the universes are repeatedly cycling in and out of manifestation. So an avidya is existing beginninglessly, and every time that the universe or a particular universe is again coming into manifestation, then that avidya is enveloping all of the jivas that are existing in that universe. It's as if pervading that plane. And then again, when that universe dissolves, then there's nothing there, so to speak. So the avidya, so to speak, as if withdraws. It's not that the jivas that are subject to avidya are freed from it, so to speak, but in this context it means, the active functioning of it pervading the psyche, pervading the different, dynamics that take place in the psyche in the context of the manifest universe.
Okay, thank you, understood. And also, I have one question which we discussed during the last class. Can I ask now about it? It's about the commentary on the Srimad Bhagavatam verse 11 to 37, which Sri Jiva Gosvami wrote, where he says that in the case of the jiva who is conditioned by, who is not intent on Bhagavan, Maya spreads her ignorance on this jiva, and in the opposite case, in the case of intentness of jiva upon Bhagavan, he says that Maya manifests the essential nature Svarupa of the jiva, preceded by the removal of absorption in the gunas, and liberates the jiva. And I was wondering, the use of this language that Maya specifically manifests essential nature of Svarupa, how to understand it, because before I was thinking that this happens, the manifestation of Svarupa and the liberation of Jiva and removal from the absorption of gunas because of the influence of the Para-Shakti or Chit-Shakti on the Jiva, who becomes intent upon Bhagavan. Then the Para-Shakti or Chit-Shakti starts to affect this Jiva, and this is the reason why this manifestation of Svarupa and the removal of absorption into the gunas and liberations happens. But here Jiva Gosvami says that Maya does it. How to understand this apparent controversial, so to speak? Could you please clarify?
So it's describing the same thing from 2 different perspectives. For example, suppose there's some criminal in prison, and then from the governor or some political authority, a pardon is granted. Then the warden of the prison will go and bring that person out of the prison and say, okay, you're free to go. So one perspective you can say is that the governor freed the prisoner by pardoning them. Another perspective on the same exact event is that the warden freed the prisoner. So it's the same thing, but just being described from the role that Maya has in releasing the jiva from the entanglement that she's subjected the jiva to, which takes place precisely because of the agency of the Sarup Shakti, just as you described. So there's no contradiction. It's just the exact same thing described from the opposite side of the elements involved.
Understood. So could it be said that Parashakti affects also Maya in such a way that Maya starts to affect Jiva in such a way that it becomes liberated from gunas? Or so there is also an effect of Maya which is happening on, or an effect of Parashakti or Chit Shakti which is also simultaneously happening on Maya itself, so that it starts affect Jiva.
Sure, you could say that. Sunlight dispels darkness. The opening of the Bhagavatam, Dhamna Svena Sada Nirasta Kuhakam, that all Kuhaka, or this magic, is considered to refer to Maya by the commentators. So, that supreme entity by whose own light the Maya is forever dispelled. This is how one way that the supreme entity is described in the opening of the Bhagavatam. So that implies that by the agency or the influence of the Sarup Shakti, there is the dispelling or the pushing or keeping at a distance the Maya Shakti. So yeah, you could say like that.
Mm-hmm. Understood. Thank you very much. I also have one little question about the verse 71 itself, about the significance of addressing Krishna here as nanda-tanūja specifically, which, as you explained, appeals to more personal affection rather than, for example, using like Aishwarya-related designations, Supreme Lord or Paramatma. I was wondering, does this deliberate choice of intimate relationship terminology suggest that in the prayer, acknowledging one's fallen state and ultimately, for example, genuine surrender to Bhagavan is more authentically possible when approaching the divine through this relationship of intimacy rather than awe-inspiring addressing of the Bhagavan? Does this specific verse also suggestive of this mood? Would it be said in this way?
This verse is certainly composed to nourish or to facilitate the prayer of those who aspire to that type of personal relation, specifically the Madhurya relation with the Krishna of Braja. And it's certainly possible for persons to achieve liberation from the ocean of material existence and entrance into Vaikuntha and engagement in Bhagavan's service eternally, not by praying to Krishna specifically, but to the Aishwarya aspects of Bhagavan, Narayan, or other forms. So both are possible, but generally from our Gaudiya-specific perspective, the Madhurya-centric approach, if you will, is considered to be more endearing and something that's, strongly inspiring, if you will. So there is a statement of Jiva Gosvami in one or two places where he speaks of the greater efficacy of the Madhurya-focused approach, but never to the implication that the other approach is ineffective or in any way defective. It's fully, substantial and qualitative and admirable and so forth. But there is some edge, if you will, in the Gaudiya viewpoint towards the, focus on Krishna of Braja as the principal Ishta Devata.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Baba.
All right, well, we can conclude there for the evening, and in our next reading, we'll dive into the next prakaran, which will be a little more spicy, if you will. We've been hearing the discussion of humility for some time, and now we come to the Bhaktas' nishta, and some of their expressions are a bit bold and a bit colorful. So we'll, relish to the extent of the purity of our hearts, the qualities of that aspect and side of a Bhakta's bhav in the coming discussion. So I'll conclude there. Vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Yeah, Shri Radha. Thank you.